Well, I heard about a lonely frog that went to visit a fortune teller. This poor frog felt rejected. Nothing was going his way. Didn't think he'd ever find a soulmate, didn't know what his purpose in life was, and he finally decided he was going to go see a fortune teller. So this frog goes into the psychic and he sits down and he says, I just want to know if I'm ever going to find true love. And she says, let me see your palm. And so the frog extends his palm. She begins to look at his palm and she says, oh yes, I've got some very good news for you. She said, you're about to meet a young lady. She said, this young lady is going to take a special interest in you. She's going to get to know you in a real and personal way. And the frog says, well, that's great. When do I meet this girl? And the psychic said, next semester in her biology class. So I know it's terrible. Sometimes things go from bad to worse in a hurry, don't they? Kind of like that joke, right? But sometimes life can do that to us. Sometimes things are bad, and then they get even worse. We're going to be in the book of Ruth tonight in the first chapter. That's how the book of Ruth begins. It begins bad, and in a hurry, it gets even worse. Now, it gets good. If you know the story of Ruth, it's going to end very well, but it starts off negative and then gets even worse from there. And so we're going to see that in the opening verses of this book. We're going to see that it's bad, and then we're going to see that it's worse. But as you might be turning there to Ruth chapter 1, this book is unique in that there are no miracles performed in the book. There is no villain in the book. In fact, it stands in sharp contrast to the book right before it, which is the book of Judges. You know, we just went through the book of Judges, and we saw God working a lot of miracles, but we also saw plenty of villains. We get into the book of Ruth, though, and it's a lot different. The story is told through a series of speeches that people make to each other rather than through a narrator that moves the story along. So it's a little bit of a change of pace from the book of Judges. But we're going to begin tonight setting up this book. So let's see how it sets up in the first 5 verses we will read right now. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. As we set up the story here, we see that it starts off bad and then it gets worse. How does it start off bad? Verse 1 says, it was the days when the judges ruled. It was the time of the judges. Right away, that's bad. Because we just went through the book of Judges. Wasn't it almost always bad in the book of Judges? Because we see the same line over and over in the book of Judges that we kept seeing when we went through it. Everyone did that which was right, remember this, in his own eyes. Everybody was living contrary to God's word. People were doing whatever they wanted to do, not what God wanted them to do. So spiritually, it was dark. This was a bad time in the nation of Israel. It starts off bad. There is no king in Israel. But then things begin to get worse. Now we're introduced to certain individuals. Elimelech, who we don't know a whole lot about, but he was from Bethlehem. Elimelech has his wife Naomi, and together they have 2 sons. But it gets worse, right? He dies. How? We don't know. But there's a famine in the land. See, it's getting worse. The famine probably led them to relocate to try to find some food. And along the way, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi with 2 young sons to raise on her own. And look, I'm not trying to say that, women can't do it or anything like that, but let's put ourselves in this culture. Without her husband to take care of her, she was not receiving his pension. She did not get his life insurance policy. She had no Medicare or Medicaid. She couldn't put the boys on WIC or get food stamps. There was no program in place to support a widow. Her best hope was that her sons would one day be able to take care of her. One day these boys will grow up and they will take care of their dear old mother. But then it gets worse. The boys died. How? Again, we don't know. It seems like they died quite young because both left behind widows and both were childless. So they evidently died, probably shortly into their marriage. Could it be that there was a battle in which they died? Could it be because of the famine? We really don't know. But now all at once, Naomi has found herself to be widowed, and her greatest hope of her 2 sons are now off the table. She has no other children to take care of her. There is no social program in place that she could fall back on. It would be difficult for her to go out into the workforce and earn a living for herself. Her chances of getting remarried were incredibly slim. And so she finds herself starting off bad, but quickly getting worse. When does the book of Ruth take place? It comes after the book of Judges, but it does not take place chronologically after the book of Judges. It takes place during the book of Judges, as the first verse tells us. And so if you remember, and you were here on Sunday nights when we've been going through this series in Judges, we talked about the left-handed judge, Ehud was the left-handed judge, and he killed Eglon. At that point, that was during when the Moabites were oppressing Israel. So this story probably took place right around that time, and shortly after that is when Gideon became the judge of Israel. So this story probably takes place in between Ehud and Gideon's rule there in the book of Judges. Just trying to put it all in context as we set it up. But Naomi, because of her husband, they've left Israel. They are not in the promised land. They have gone into Moabite territory. This is not a Christian nation that they were living in. The Moabites did not serve the God of Israel. They worshiped mainly the god Chemosh, who was their god of war. He was like the strongest of the gods, the ones that they turned to. So we don't know much else besides what we've just read, but that's how the story is set up for us. It doesn't look very good. It's gone from bad to worse. Now that the story's set up, though, we're going to see these ladies setting off in verse 6. It says, "Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food." This means in Israel, the famine is over. So verse 7 says, she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead," meaning their husbands, "and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return to you and your people." So Naomi finds out in verse 6 that there is food back in Israel. She's from Bethlehem. The author here is making a play on words because Bethlehem means house of bread. And she says, "I've heard that there is now food, there is bread once again in the house of bread." And so she's going to return back to Bethlehem. And so she's telling her daughters, "I'm releasing you. Y'all don't have to follow me. It's been rough. I'm a visitor in your land. I'm going back home, and you ladies can stay here. Return not to your father's house, as they would typically say, but return to your mother's house." This lets us know that their fathers were probably deceased as well. All the men in this story are dying, and that's why I think it was probably because of one of the battles that was taking place here in the book of Judges. But she says, "Return to your mother's house, because there's nothing left that I can do for you. Maybe you can help them, maybe they can help you, and you guys can be good for each other." She's referring to a custom here. We need to understand this custom, the custom known as the levirate marriage. We see this in verse 11. Naomi said, because they said, "We'll go with you," but in verse 11, Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." getting into a lament here from Naomi, like we talked about this morning. But she's referring to this custom known as the levirate marriage, which literally means brother-in-law. And the levirate marriage says that if a woman dies without a child, if the woman's husband dies without giving her a child, that she is to marry an eligible brother if he had one, a brother that was not married. The idea was that she should not be left without child. So if she marries her late husband's brother, she can have a son by him, and that she can have a son that will one day take care of her. Again, that was how the system was set up. They didn't have these social programs in place. So the law of the levirate marriage was intended to protect them. But she says, ladies, I don't have any more sons, and I don't have a husband to give me more sons. And even if I were to remarry today, are you going to stick around and hope that I have not one son, but two? She had two daughters-in-law. And are you going to stick around until those babies come of age and then get married? These women would probably be past childbearing years themselves if they were to wait around for her to remarry and have sons, for them to grow up. And she's basically saying, ladies, it's not going to happen. We gave it our best shot. It's over. The hand of the Lord is against me, but I'm releasing you from the levirate marriage for you to go back to your mother's house. I'm setting you free. We see the custom in verse 11, and that leads to the crying in verse 14. It says, they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. We see them crying here in verse 14. Each lady had experienced something that they should not have experienced. Widowhood had visited them all too young. They had been there for each other. They had their common suffering, but now it's too late. They realize that this is goodbye, and they cry, and Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, and she returns back to her people and most likely back to her gods. We see the kiss in verse 14. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but it says Ruth clung to her. And I love the way that verse 14 ends. But this is the last time we see Orpah in Scripture. She does not come up again, so we don't know where she goes from here. If she remarries, we don't know. If she goes back to her god Chemosh, we don't know, but we assume that that's what would have happened. It's hard to imagine she went back to Moab and served the God of Israel. She might have. I would love to meet her in heaven one day. But that's not the way the text leads us to believe. We kind of get the impression that when she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, she was kissing the Lord goodbye. She was kissing her salvation goodbye. And she leaves Naomi. She cries. She gives her a goodbye kiss, and that's the last we see of her. I believe she forever stands alongside King Agrippa, who looked at Paul and said, almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian. Somebody who got so close to doing it right, she began to journey with her mother-in-law towards the promised land, but then she stopped. She kissed her mother-in-law, and she returned back to her pagan land and most likely to her pagan gods. Orpah only went halfway. You can't just go halfway. We don't celebrate people that go halfway. We would not celebrate Neil Armstrong if he went halfway to the moon, right? We celebrate him because he went all the way to the moon. We would not celebrate George Washington if he went halfway across the Delaware River. He went all the way with his soldiers. That's why we celebrate their accomplishments. We don't stand here and applaud Orpah for going halfway to Bethlehem, to the promised land. She went halfway, she kissed her mother-in-law, and she turned back. We cannot go halfway to heaven. We cannot halfway follow Jesus. We must go all the way, or we do not go at all. And so Orpah's story is a sad one. We've seen in the book of Ruth, as we've set it up now, they've set out for the promised land. But we're going to pick up now in verse 17, and we're going to see what happens next here as they set off for Bethlehem. Verse 15, she said, this is Naomi, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. She's trying to talk her out of it, but we see Ruth's persistence now in verse 16. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. We see Ruth's persistence here. We see her pleading. She's saying, please do not urge me to go back from following you. If Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and lost her salvation, we see Ruth clinging to her mother-in-law and finding her salvation. She's the picture of a person desperate to be saved. She's the lady in that parable that tore her house apart until she found her missing coin. She's that merchant that sold all that he had until he was able to purchase that pearl of great price. She's not someone who is just casually hoping to find salvation. She's a picture of someone who is proactive, desperately trying to find what she needed. I'm not talking about losing our salvation. I'm not talking about earning our salvation through works. Orpah is not a picture of someone who lost her salvation, but she is a picture of someone who turned down the opportunity to be saved. And Ruth is not a picture of someone who earned her salvation, but she is a picture of someone who found her salvation because she truly called on the name of the Lord. We see Ruth's persistence in verse 16. Now we see her promise. This fivefold promise, I already read part of it in verse 16, but we see it again. She says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me and you. I love this promise that she makes. 5 promises she makes here in this one sentence. Gary Phillips said that this promise contains a vow of companionship with Naomi, a vow of commitment to Naomi, and a vow to commemorate Naomi. Ruth was pledging to be faithful to her mother-in-law. When she was no longer legally bound to do anything with Naomi, she committed to staying with her. I'm going to follow you. If you live in Bethlehem, I'll go to Bethlehem. If you go 1,000 miles from my mother's house, I will follow you there. Your people, your kinfolks, your friends, they're going to become my people. If you associate with them, that's where I'm going to hang out. Wherever you lodge, that's where I will lodge. You might as well add a room onto the house, Naomi, because I'm going to live with you. I'm going to stay with you. And most importantly, your God will be my God. No longer Kamash, but Yahweh. If you're going to serve the Lord, then I will serve the Lord as well. And she even promises for all of time, wherever you're buried, put my plot right next to yours, because we will be tied together, united in our death for all of time. And I believe they are united in their death. 2 ladies that believed in the Lord that I believe that we will meet in heaven. This speaks to the character of Ruth, doesn't it? Nobody forced her to do this. This lets us know what kind of person Ruth truly was. She knew Naomi would have no one to take care of her, and she determined that she was going to be the one to take care of Naomi. The best part of this promise is that she says, your God will be my God. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and went to her god Chemosh, but Ruth kissed Chemosh goodbye and she went to be with the Lord. We see Ruth's persistence, we see her promise. In verse 17, though, we see her punishment. She puts herself under oath when she says, and may the Lord do so to me, and so much more also, if anything but death separates us. She's referring to capital punishment here. She puts herself under an oath. It's believed that she makes some type of hand gesture while she says this. Like we might do this across our throat. Like she's saying something like this, may the Lord do this to me if anything but death separates us. In other words, may God strike me dead if I don't keep the promise that I made. It's a beautiful vow that she makes, a beautiful commitment. This was not some half-hearted promise or empty rhetoric. Well, some people do that, don't they? People will promise you everything, and you've learned not to hold your breath. You take it with a grain of salt. If old so-and-so says it, you know they have no intention of keeping their promise. Some people will promise you $1 million, but you know they couldn't muster a nickel. Some people are defined by their broken promises. If they say, oh, I'm going to be there, you don't even bother saving them a seat. To some people, promises are like bad habits meant to be broken. But not so with Ruth. She was putting herself under penalty of capital punishment. If I break my promise, to say how we used to say when we were kids, you ever say this? Cross my heart and hope to die. stick a needle in my eye. Did you ever say that when you were a kid? It's so weird to me as I think about this now in adulthood that the thought of death did not bother me as a kid, but sticking a needle in my eye, boy, that just gave me the creeps. And so I never wanted to break a promise. If I crossed my heart and someone's going to stick a needle in my eye, boy, I made sure that I was going to keep that promise. And that's what Naomi's doing. Ruth looks at Naomi and she says, cross my heart and hope to die. If anything but death separates us, stick a needle in my eye if your God does not become my God. She's willing to go all the way here with her mother-in-law. That should be how all Christians operate, right? Our word should be our bond. If we say we're going to do something, we should do it. With her limited knowledge of God, she knew better than to call herself as a false witness. If this young widow from a pagan society can think enough of God to keep her vows, how much more should we keep the promises that we've made, those of us who have been born again? We should all have this level of commitment in our relationships with our mothers-in-law, with our spouses, with our children, with our coworkers and our church members. I'm not asking if you're a promise maker, but are you a promise breaker? If you tell somebody you're going to do it, can they trust that you're going to go all the way through? Do you honor the commitments that you make to others? Have you made commitments to the Lord? Oh God, I'm going to read my Bible every day. God, if you heal me of this, I'm going to give you my life. God, I'm going to honor you with my tithes and offerings this year, or whatever promise you make to the Lord. How you doing with those promises? Were they New Year's resolutions you made 8-9 months ago? Did you make some promise to God maybe last Sunday down at the altar and you told God, I'm going to do this? How you doing with those commitments? May we strive to be like Ruth, who put herself under penalty of death. God, cross my heart and hope to die. Are you a promise keeper? Have you promised the Lord your life? God, if you save me, if you'll forgive my sins, I'm going to live my life for you for the rest of my life. How you doing on that? All those years ago when you got saved, are you still serving the Lord? Are you still denying yourself? Are you still taking up your cross? Are you still daily following after him? Live your life for the Lord. Don't go halfway and kiss him goodbye, but go all the way and give him your life. If there's an Orpah among us tonight, you ventured out halfway to God, don't go back. Keep walking. Keep getting closer to God. Maybe you've turned your back on him. Like Orpah, you've kissed your mother-in-law, you're on your way back home, but it's not too late. You can still make a U-turn even right now. Turn away from your old gods, turn away from your old way of life, and turn to Jesus tonight. If you've made that promise to the Lord, though, let's make sure that we follow through with what we tell him we're going to do. He keeps his promises to us. May we keep our promises to him. So let's strive to be like Naomi, like Ruth, and not like Orpah. Would you stand with me, please, tonight? With your heads bowed and your eyes closed. I told you we had conference tonight. Wasn't going to keep you here all night. Going to respect your time. But before we get into our conference and do the things that we need to do, I want to thank you once again for tuning in to our live broadcast here at Putman Baptist Church. As always, we appreciate you being a part of our service from wherever you choose to watch. But we want to let you know that if you should ever have any questions about what you've heard in the morning's message, or questions about how to be saved, to know whether or not you're going to go to heaven one day, or you'd like prayer or anything else, we would love to hear from you. Just because you're not here in the building doesn't mean that you're not still part of this fellowship. So please, feel free to give us a call. You can reach me on my cell phone at 426-3706, or you can call the church office, or send us a message right here on the church Facebook page, and somebody will get in touch with you very soon. Thank you again. God bless you, and hope you have a great day.